Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. We're going to be talking about what impact will the Biden administration have on the corporate boardroom. And joining me are two, quote, experts in the field of corporate governance. Please welcome Amy Simmerman and Steve Bochner, who are partners with the corporate group with Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
So we'll get right to this. And Steve, I'll start with you. So what should boardrooms expect in the way of impact from the Biden administration? I certainly suspect that some of the movements today, stakeholder stuff, will be supported. And then if we look all the way left, you see that there's Senator Warren's federal governance plan, which would, at its core, put employees on the board. So when you think of all those things, what do you think are the impacts that just people should just keep their eyes open for?
Yeah, well, the short answer is I don't know, because we can't really be sure yet. But certainly over the last 20 years, we've seen a real trend towards more state regulatory and legislative impact in boardrooms and board composition and board governance. And I would certainly expect with the Biden administration that trend to not weaken and to likely be enhanced not only by topics like diversity and composition, but how boardrooms operate, and perhaps something, as you alluded to, maybe something as profound as federal legislation dictating sort of who goes on boards. But I think this trend that's been 20 plus years long, starting when I began practicing, of having mostly white males around the boardroom table who are friends of the CEO, to today mandated diversity in some states, mandated independence through some of the case law in Delaware that Amy's going to talk about in the listing standards. So I think there's going to be more wind in those sails, and I think a lot depends on how progressive an agenda is the Biden administration pursues, and probably a lot depends on what happens with the Senate.
Amy?
Yeah, I agree with that, Steve. I think that, as you intimated, Delaware law is very enabling of what corporations want to do. It's agnostic. That said, though, from a Delaware law standpoint, we're also seeing a move toward a lot more of a focus on ESG issues and a lot more talk about diversity in the boardroom. Delaware statute was amended several years back to allow companies to become public benefit corporations. Just last week, actually, one of our clients that is a large public company announced its intent to convert to a public benefit corporation, which takes into account considerations other than stockholder value. It looks at things like those materially affected by the company's conduct. So we saw Delaware adopt that sort of regime that companies can opt into. Delaware corporations can now seek a certification that they've adopted sustainability standards and things like that. And of course, I see a lot of discussion about diversity requirements and how they intersect with Delaware law. So you're right, we're just seeing a huge movement in this direction. And as Steve also suggested, we've already seen pressure over time on how boards are composed. So again, Delaware law gives a lot of latitude, but we've of course had a lot of pressure for boards to become more independent. And Delaware law itself has increasingly focused on the independence of directors. And I think with some of these other issues, we'll see those types of things creep their way into Delaware law as well. And I think Steve's right that under a Biden administration, this movement will just march along and likely intensify.
Yeah, I just add, I think it was just last week an SEC committee recommended some standards regarding ESG disclosure, and I think there's a debate occurring right now among should disclosure be principles based, which I think under the current SEC administration, at least, that's what's been followed, more of a principles based approach, or should there be actual standards by which investors and others can compare companies? And so I think you're going to see that debate play out, but I would expect some pressure to be applied for a much more robust sort of ESG agenda, perhaps standards-based rather than principles-based under a Biden administration. We could see that occurring again, depending upon how the agencies go in terms of who's there, as well as what happens, who controls the Senate.
Well, it's interesting that no matter who's in power, the institutional shareholders have found that their ability to withhold votes or vote no on directors has been very powerful, and large institutional investors that have traditionally been passive have now sort of flexed their muscles. So I think that influence, regardless of what Biden or even what Trump had done in the past, I don't see that lessening at all. Would you agree?
I would. I think that's another trend in terms of stockholder power that's been advancing through pressure from large institutional stakeholders over the past decade or more.
Yeah. So let's take a little switch and let's look at another impact, and that'll be the Biden impact on the SEC. Because I say that it's not really it is a Biden impact because they'll be announcing a new chairman. And, there's plenty of things that have been talked about by chairmen previous to Chairman Clayton. One of those is universal ballot, or, and there's all kinds of decisions, and I don't know offhand what the makeup of the SEC commission will be. But Steve, what do you see as will be some of the issues relative to the change in administration when we look at the SEC?
Yeah, I think some of that will again depend on whether the Republicans control the Senate or not, because that may dictate kind of how moderate or progressive a chair we see. So that chair role, I think, will be very influential in terms of what happens at the SEC level. We're coming out of an SEC which saw slightly fewer enforcement cases than under Mary Jo White or Chairman Clayton's predecessor's tenure. I would expect under a Biden administration enforcement to tick up. And I think the predominance of that of enforcement actions under Clayton were securities offerings, but I think in areas that we've seen historically, like insider trading and FD and those kind of cases, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see more pressure for an uptick in those things. I mentioned earlier, under the current administration, there's really a principles-based approach on a lot of disclosure, and actually you saw quite a bit of reform from accredited investor to SEC working groups on proxy plumbing to MD&A disclosure. Just recently, some proposals trying to bring more current the employee stock exemption rule 701 and S8. So you've seen a lot of that occurring, maybe a nod towards making things a little easier for businesses and more streamlined and so on. And I don't think you'll see that continuing at the pace it is under a Biden administration. Maybe you'll see a rollback, again, depending upon how moderate of a chair there is and what sort of pressure. But I think it's going to be a very tricky seat to be in. The SEC, as you know, always balances capital raising with investor protection. And so I think you will see, regardless of who it is, I think you'll see a lot of pressure towards that balance to move more in the investor protection era, perhaps. And again, how far we go in that direction will depend on who the chair is, and then the sort of, unfortunately, political pressure that's brought to bear, which I think will be a fair amount.
Yeah. Amy, what do you have to add?
Well, from my standpoint, as someone who focuses a lot on Delaware law principles for corporate governance, I think one thing we'll have to keep an eye on is how the interplay between Delaware law and federal law and investor pressure plays out. So historically, Delaware law has governed how corporations conduct themselves. And obviously, over the years, there's been more and more federal regulation. And I think every decade there's some new flavor of how these things interact. But I think with all the topics we're talking about, ESG and what the SEC does and universal ballot and things like that, there's going to be increased pressure on how much can companies self-order under Delaware law versus how much do you have federal intervention and pressure coming from other angles, and how does that start to transform the typical Delaware landscape? And one other interesting data point is, of course, Joe Biden is from Delaware, so there will be a lot of people chirping about the importance of Delaware law and the importance of flexibility under state law, but there are obviously a lot of other pressures coming to bear.
Do you think that there's the possibility that when we had all the debate on the proxy plumbing and the proxy advisors, that there's a chance that some of that could be rolled back?
I don't know. There's certainly a move afoot to try to reform the proxy environment, modernize it. There's issuers would certainly like to know who their stockholders are with good privacy. I think that's hard to do today, to communicate directly to stockholders. And there's certainly been some dialogue that I've been part of at the SEC on committees to try to do just that. And it'll be very interesting to see whether that continues or stops dead in the tracks. So I think that's a TBD.
So Amy, one of the first approvals or debates that the new chairman at the SEC is going to have is they will have on their desks this submission from Nasdaq on approving a diversity-focused listing requirement that sort of sets up minimum standards for Nasdaq-listed companies. And, that's not to be unexpected, maybe with a little twist that, now there's in that is a LGBTQ reporting feature of that as well, which, is going to open up a new window. What's interesting to me is, with all my years in the governance, I have come across a lot of people that are working very hard not to be categorized as a minority director or whatever. They are working hard to be known as a corporate director. And yet now we're going to be putting people in some challenging positions, okay, by having to self-identify. And companies are going to want them to do it, because if not, they're going to be in violation of, Nasdaq listing requirements. So, and I know this is a very sensitive question, but any thought on how companies might maneuver in this if this actually gets approved, or is there a chance that this could be either softened or changed or somewhat altered somehow?
Well, I'll certainly let Steve weigh in a bit, since he's pretty close to stock exchange developments. But my own 2 cents would be that it's difficult to resist efforts like this. They're inherently likely to succeed, if you ask me. And I think you're right that these are delicate issues. I've had to navigate them myself. I think that all companies are navigating them. Our law firm navigates it like every other law firm. How to deal with self-disclosure and diversity and so forth. But I think the reality is, and we all know it, that there is an intensified focus on diversity, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing, but it is creating near-term delicate situations. But the reality is, boards are increasingly expected to be diverse. We're seeing it from all kinds of angles. The California laws, other states' laws, which have sometimes taken a disclosure-based approach. We saw Goldman Sachs take a stand with regard to its underwriting activities about a year ago on diversity issues. It's just coming from all sorts of directions. And we're all just going to have to do our best to navigate it together.
So, Steve, you got 30 seconds to close on this.
Yeah, I think to answer your question directly, I think companies will, in D&O questionnaires, just say, do you self-identify and comply that way? And so people can choose to self-identify or not self-identify. And if they don't, then I think companies will have the obligation to comply with whatever listing standards and rules are out there. But yeah, it's coming from a lot of directions. We have Congress weighing in a long time ago on independence and audit committee independence. We have the listing standards with independence. We have Delaware law focus on increasing independence. Now we have 2 separate California statutes dealing with gender diversity and underrepresented communities, and now a stock exchange weighing in. So I think that's just a trend that companies have actually gotten used to dealing with and are going to have to get used to navigating and filling their boards with diverse candidates even more. So I'd expect that trend to continue under the Biden administration, to go back to your first question.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time. Again, we are all sitting on the edge of our seats to see, first of all, what happens in Georgia, the state where I live. And I can tell you that it's very emotional here. And second of all, what will that mean? Certainly if somebody has a clear path, that's going to mean that we can anticipate more swinging of the pendulum, I think is accurate. So I want to thank you both for taking the time, and look forward to catching up with you once we know what's going to happen. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, DK.
Thanks for having us.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.